Paul kept glancing down at something in his pants, and Kristen couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something was seriously wrong. When she finally discovered the truth, it left her reeling. Without wasting a moment, she picked up the phone and called the police. That same night, her ex-husband was taken into custody. But the real question lingered. Was his explanation enough to put her mind at ease? And how could Kristen ensure the safety of her little boy moving forward? Stick around to hear the full story. The evening light seeped through the heavy curtains of Kristen's apartment, casting long shadows over the worn-out furniture. She had chosen this place for its practicality: 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and just enough space for her and Paul to live comfortably. She placed her bag down on the kitchen counter, pausing to take in the silence that had filled the room since she and Justine had signed the divorce papers 6 months ago. It wasn't a peaceful silence, but a thick, weighted one, full of things left unsaid. Paul, their 4-year-old son, sat quietly in the corner, building something out of colorful plastic blocks, his small hands moving in steady rhythm. Kristen's eyes softened at the sight of him. She had fought for custody, not out of spite, but because she knew Justine's world was too unstable, too ephemeral to provide the grounding Paul needed. Justine, with his endless dreams of becoming a musician, had never quite understood the harshness of reality like she did. Kristen had always been the practical one, working long hours, paying the bills, making sure Paul's life was steady, even if hers wasn't. But now, even with her carefully laid plans, there was something she couldn't control: the uncertainty of co-parenting. They had agreed on shared custody. Paul would spend 1 week with her and 1 week with Justine. It had seemed like the only fair solution, but fairness hadn't taken into account the differences in how they raised their son. Justine was all about freedom, encouraging Paul to explore, to create, while Kristen worried about rules, schedules, and making sure he had a proper routine. And Paul, caught in the middle, was starting to show signs of confusion. Little things, subtle shifts in behavior that Kristen couldn't ignore. "Paul, sweetie, are you hungry?" Kristen asked, walking over to him. Her voice was soft but tinged with fatigue from a long day at work. Paul didn't answer right away. He continued fiddling with the blocks, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then, without looking up, he mumbled, "Not yet." Kristen watched him for a moment longer before heading to the kitchen. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It had been this way for a few weeks now. Paul's mood swings, the way he would sometimes stop playing and stand in the middle of the room, staring into space, his small hands fidgeting with his pants. At first, she thought it was just a phase, but the behavior persisted, especially during the weeks he spent with her. She had mentioned it to Justine once, but he had brushed it off, claiming Paul was just being a kid. "Kids do weird stuff all the time, Chris," he had said during one of their terse exchanges over the phone. "You're just overthinking it. Let him be." Kristen had let it go at the time, not wanting to stir up more tension between them. Justine was already on edge, especially after finding out about Luke. Her new relationship had clearly struck a nerve, though Justine had never admitted it outright. Instead, he had sent her a letter, filled with thinly veiled threats and accusations, accusing her of moving on too quickly, of ruining their family. Kristen hadn't known what to make of it, but it left her shaken, constantly questioning Justine's motives. How much of his anger was about her, and how much of it was really about Paul? Kristen sighed, turning back to check on Paul. He was standing now, his small body still as a statue in the middle of the living room. His hands, as usual, were resting on the front of his pants, pressing gently, as if trying to understand something only he could feel. "Paul?" she called, her voice more urgent than before. "Paul? What are you doing?" He didn't respond at first, just stood there, eyes distant. Then, slowly, he looked up at her, his face blank, as though waking from a dream. "Nothing," he said quietly. And then, just as suddenly as he had stopped, he returned to his blocks, sitting down and picking up where he had left off. Kristen's heart raced. This wasn't nothing. It was becoming more frequent, this strange, inexplicable pause in his play. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Her motherly instinct, sharp and unyielding, told her that something wasn't right. Was it the effect of bouncing between homes, between two completely different parenting styles? Or was it something deeper, something she didn't yet understand? Kristen bit her lip, her mind racing with possibilities, most of them unsettling. Later that night, after Paul had gone to bed, she sat on the couch, phone in hand, staring at Justine's number. She needed to talk to him, to figure this out together, for Paul's sake. But the thought of hearing his voice, of dealing with his unpredictable temper, made her hesitate. In the end, she didn't call. Instead, she sat there, the apartment quiet around her, the weight of everything she couldn't fix pressing down like a shadow over her heart. Paul had been acting strange for the past few days, doing things that didn't quite make sense for his age. He would sit still for unusually long periods, his small face scrunched in concentration, staring at his hands or fiddling with his pockets. At first, Kristen dismissed it as childish curiosity. Kids that age did odd things. But Paul was still so young, too young, she thought, to get so lost in something like this. And it wasn't just a one-time thing. Every afternoon, at the same time, like clockwork, he repeated the odd behavior. It gnawed at her, this strangeness. She tried to bring it up to Justine casually the other day, but even that conversation had left her unsettled. Justine was Paul's father, her ex, and as much as she hated to admit it, dealing with him had always been complicated. That day, she had asked in the calmest tone she could manage, "Has Paul been doing anything unusual when he's with you?" Justine's response had been swift, defensive. "Paul's fine. Maybe you should worry less about what he's doing and more about being a mother." His voice had that edge to it, the familiar mix of disdain and irritation. "You've been busy with your new little fling, haven't you? Maybe that's why you're missing what's happening with your son." The conversation had spiraled into the usual fight. Kristen had tried to keep calm, but the sharpness of his words, his constant undermining of her abilities as a mother, always pushed her over the edge. Justine had never been easy, especially not after the breakup. He had this knack for twisting her concerns into criticisms of her, like Paul's strange behavior wasn't real, like she was just imagining it. Or worse, like she was using their son as a pawn to provoke him. It all felt off. The way he deflected, the way his irritation flared up at the smallest mention of Paul. Something was wrong, and Kristen couldn't shake that feeling. Later that evening, as Kristen sat across from Michelle at their favorite cafe, the warmth of her coffee mug in her hands, she voiced the worries she'd been holding back for days. "It's just, Paul's been acting so strange. And when I asked Justine, it didn't go well. He got defensive, almost too defensive." Michelle frowned, her fingers tapping lightly on the table as she listened. "You think it's just a phase, right? I mean, kids do weird things all the time, don't they?" Kristen nodded slowly. "Maybe. But it feels like something more. The way he acts. It's like he's distracted or waiting for something." She sighed, feeling the weight of her thoughts settle over her. "And Justine, he's been acting weirder than usual too." Michelle leaned in, lowering her voice. "You think Justine's involved in some way?" The idea had crossed Kristen's mind more than once, but hearing Michelle say it out loud made it all the more real. I don't know, he's been angry ever since I started dating again. Last month he sent me this letter saying he'd make my life unbearable. I didn't think much of it then, but now Michelle's face darkened. Kristen, you know Justine's temper. You don't think he'd— I don't know, Kristen interrupted, her voice shaking slightly. But what if he's doing something to Paul? What if he's using him somehow? Michelle was silent for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she considered the possibility. Look, if Justine's really that bitter, there's no telling what he might do. The thought had been lurking in the back of her mind, unspoken. It sounds insane, she whispered half to herself. No, Michelle said firmly. It doesn't sound insane at all. Justine could absolutely do something like that. You need to check. Kristen nodded, her throat tightening with anxiety. The idea of her son being used, of Justine manipulating the situation, was unbearable. But the more she thought about it, the more the pieces started to fit. The letter, the defensiveness, Paul's behavior. It all felt connected. She could no longer chalk it up to coincidence. That night, after putting Paul to bed, Kristen went through his clothes meticulously. She examined every seam, every pocket, her hands trembling slightly as she worked. Each piece of clothing told her nothing, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was there, and whatever it was, she was going to find it. What did he do to Paul? One evening, as usual, Chris turned on the music and hummed along. Suddenly, Paul stood up and touched his crotch and looked up at her with wide, confused eyes, and said, "Dad does this all the time." The words had pierced her like a jagged shard of glass, freezing her in place. The sound of her pulse roaring in her ears as she stared at her poor and innocent child, unable to process what he had just said. Her heart ached. She ran to hug her son tightly. Was Justin, her ex-husband, capable of something so vile? Had he really done that? Her thoughts whirled like a storm she couldn't outrun. She knew Justin had always been unpredictable, volatile even, but this? She never thought he would cross such a boundary, not with their child. But she couldn't shake the disgust, the unease that crawled under her skin. Something was wrong, and even if she couldn't see it, she felt it. Kristen's breaths grew shallow as a cold chill slid down her spine. It wasn't just about Paul's strange behavior anymore. It was about protecting him from something she couldn't yet prove existed. The decision came quietly, slipping into her thoughts without fanfare. She had to go to the police. Justin had to be stopped, even if she didn't have all the answers yet. At the station, the air was thick with tension as Kristen explained her fears. Every word felt like it was being pulled from her chest. "I know it sounds crazy," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "But Paul, he said things that make me believe Justin's been doing something to him." The officer, a tall woman with stern eyes, nodded and scribbled in her notebook. "Anything involving children is taken seriously. We'll need to look into it immediately." Kristen nodded, though her stomach churned. She had expected hesitation, maybe disbelief, but the gravity of the officer's response made everything feel more real, terrifyingly real. She had hoped, deep down, that maybe she had misunderstood, that maybe this was just a misunderstanding born from stress. But now, the wheels were in motion and there was no going back. Later that day, police cars rolled up to Justin's house. Kristen watched from a distance, her fingers white-knuckling the steering wheel as officers approached the front door. A few tense moments passed before Justin, wild-eyed and disheveled, appeared at the threshold. When he saw the police, his face twisted into a mask of fear. Without warning, he bolted, sprinting down the driveway like a man running from something far worse than an arrest. Kristen's heart dropped. Why would he run if he was innocent? Her suspicions, once just a simmer, now boiled over. She watched as the officers caught up with him, wrestling him to the ground, and felt a sick satisfaction. Justin was hiding something. He had to be. Hours later, Kristen found herself in a sterile interrogation room. The silence was suffocating as she waited for news. Finally, the officer returned, her face unreadable. Kristen braced herself. "We've spoken with Justin," the officer began, folding her arms across her chest. "He ran because he's been using drugs after the divorce. He was afraid of being arrested for possession." Kristen's heart thudded in her chest. "And Paul? What about what he said?" The officer sighed, rubbing her temples. "We questioned him thoroughly and even used a polygraph. Justin passed. He doesn't seem to know anything about Paul's behavior, and we found no evidence of abuse." The words landed heavily, sinking into Kristen like stones in deep water. She wanted to feel relief, to trust that the nightmare was over, but instead a hollow confusion settled in. If Justin wasn't the cause, then what was? "We'll keep an eye on him, and of course he's being fined for the drug use. But as of now, we don't have any grounds to hold him," the officer said, her tone firm but not unkind. "You're free to go, Miss Carter." Kristen nodded, but her mind was spinning. She left the station with more questions than she had arrived with. As she stepped into the crisp evening air, she glanced up at the darkening sky, trying to make sense of the tangled mess her life had become. Justin was out there, free again, and Paul was still a mystery she couldn't unravel. Kristen sat in the waiting room, her fingers tapping against her knee as she watched Paul flip through a picture book on the other side of the room. His small, unbothered frame felt like a contradiction to the turmoil spinning inside her head. The police had found nothing, no evidence of abuse, no signs of physical harm. It should have been a relief, but Kristen couldn't shake the feeling that something was still terribly wrong. Today, they were meeting Dr. Hampton, the pediatrician, for a more comprehensive examination. She hoped he could uncover what the police couldn't. The door to the clinic opened, and a nurse called them in. Kristen guided Paul toward the examination room, his hand resting trustingly in hers. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air as they entered, but Paul didn't seem to notice. He hopped onto the exam table with the ease of a child who had grown accustomed to doctors. Dr. Hampton was a kind-looking man in his early 50s, with thinning hair and a calm demeanor. He smiled at Paul, then turned to Kristen. "Let's start with a general checkup, just to make sure nothing is being overlooked." Kristen nodded, forcing a smile. "Thank you, Doctor." The examination finished. Dr. Hampton's expression remained neutral. He finally straightened up and offered a reassuring smile. "Well, from what I can tell, Paul is in perfect physical health. No abnormalities." Kristen swallowed, her stomach twisting. "That's good, right?" "Yes, it is," Dr. Hampton replied, leaning back in his chair. "But I sense that's not the answer you were hoping for." She shook her head, her voice soft but determined. I know something's not right. He hasn't been himself lately, and I don't think it's just normal childhood behavior." The doctor listened carefully, then offered a thoughtful nod. "If you're feeling that strongly about it, Kristen, I can refer you to a psychologist who specializes in young children. Sometimes psychological factors can manifest in ways we don't immediately recognize. Would that be acceptable?" Kristen exhaled slowly. "Yes, I think that would be best." A week later, Kristen sitting in yet another waiting room at the office of Dr. Naomi Kerr, a child psychologist. When their turn came, They were led into a soft-lit room that felt more like a cozy living space than a clinical office. Dr. Kerr greeted them warmly and invited Paul to sit in a beanbag chair. She sat opposite him, crossing her legs as she gently began asking him questions. "Paul," she said in a soothing voice, "I hear you've been spending some time with your dad lately. What kinds of things do you two do together?" Paul looked up from his drawing, his expression as calm as ever. "We play games. He teaches me to build things with Legos. Sometimes we go to the park." Dr. Kerr nodded. "That sounds fun. And at night? Does your dad read you a story before bed?" Paul shrugged. "Sometimes. Mostly he just tells me to go to sleep." "And after that?" she prompted. "What does your dad do after you fall asleep?" Paul frowned, as if considering the question for the first time. "He usually leaves the room. I don't know where he goes, but he's never there when I wake up." Kristen's heart clenched. Something about the casual way Paul mentioned it felt wrong. Dr. Kerr didn't push him further, but the silence in the room was heavy, as if the air itself was waiting for an answer that no one was ready to hear. "Thank you, Paul," Dr. Kerr said softly, smiling at him. "That was very helpful. Why don't you head back out and play for a bit?" Dr. Kerr's demeanor shifted. She looked at Kristen, concern shadowing her eyes. "It doesn't seem like there's anything immediately alarming in Paul's responses, but I'm not dismissing your concerns. Children can sometimes hide their feelings, especially if they don't understand them." What Paul mentioned about his father leaving the room. It might be worth exploring further. Kristen's chest tightened. She nodded, though inside her mind raced. What was Justin doing after Paul fell asleep? Why wasn't he there when Paul woke up? The questions swirled, unanswered, but Kristen knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to stop until she found out. Dr. Kerr finally looked up from the file and offered a small, tired smile. "I think we could all use a little break," she said, standing up. "Let's take a moment to clear our heads." Kristen nodded absently, her mind still spinning with half-formed thoughts. Was there something she had overlooked? Some hidden clue to Paul's strange behavior that she hadn't considered? The daily habit of pulling at his pants, staring inside them, always around the same time. It had to mean something, didn't it? The doctor moved to the small television mounted in the corner of the room and flipped it on. A music channel was playing quietly in the background, some kind of 80s rock ballad, and the familiar rhythm of the drums filled the room. Dr. Kerr settled back into his chair, crossing his legs as though waiting for something. Then it happened. "Dad! Dad's on TV!" Paul's voice, shrill and full of excitement, pierced through the air. He leapt from his chair and ran towards the screen, his small finger pointing excitedly at the man dancing across it. Kristen's eyes snapped to the television, startled by her son's sudden outburst. Her gaze met the unmistakable image of Michael Jackson, his famous crotch grab mid-performance, moonwalking across the stage with effortless grace. Paul, in his childish eagerness, mimicked the movement immediately. His little hands shot down to the waistband of his pants, and he pulled up in an exaggerated imitation, the same way she had seen him do every day. Then, losing his balance, he toppled over onto the carpet, giggling uncontrollably as he lay sprawled on the floor. "Like Daddy! Daddy does this dance every night," Paul declared between fits of laughter. Kristen stared, frozen in disbelief. The pieces fell together slowly, like a fog lifting. It wasn't a hidden illness or some nefarious plot hatched by her ex-husband, Justin. Paul was simply trying to mimic the moves of the pop star he had seen, and what Paul had mistaken for his father's dance was likely just something he had glimpsed on TV, or maybe even Justin showing off a silly move from his younger years. Dr. Kerr chuckled softly, the tension in the room easing. "Well, there we have it," she said, a smile playing at his lips as he glanced at Kristen. "I think we've just found the answer to Paul's strange behavior." Kristen blinked, struggling to process the simplicity of it all. Her son wasn't unwell. He wasn't being used as a pawn in some twisted game between her and Justin. He was just a little boy, innocently copying what he saw his father did. The doctor's voice interrupted her thoughts. "There's nothing medically wrong with Paul," she said gently. "Children his age are naturally curious and impressionable. What he's been doing is completely harmless, just his way of expressing what he's seen. There's no reason to worry." A wave of relief washed over Kristen, though it was tinged with a hint of embarrassment. How could she have let her fears spiral so out of control? She had involved the police, turned the simplest of childhood behaviors into a full-blown crisis, all because she had let her anxiety about Justin cloud her judgment. I guess I overreacted," Kristen admitted quietly, a small flush creeping into her cheeks. Dr. Kerr smiled understandingly. "It happens to the best of us. Parenting is stressful, and when you've been through a difficult separation like yours, it's easy to assume the worst." Kristen nodded, glancing down at Paul, who was now trying unsuccessfully to moonwalk across the floor. His laughter was infectious, and despite the weight of her previous concerns, she found herself smiling. For the first time in what felt like weeks, the tightness in her chest began to ease. Kristen had been rehearsing the conversation in her head for days. Sitting in her car just outside Justine's apartment, she felt a knot of regret tightening in her chest. The months of suspicion, the anger, and the distance she'd placed between them now seemed so unnecessary. What had started as a worry about Paul's strange behavior had spiraled into something far more toxic. She exhaled slowly, hoping the words would come naturally once she faced him. Knocking on his door, she waited, the sounds of the city pulsing in the background. Justine opened the door, surprised but composed. His eyes were guarded, as though he'd been preparing for another confrontation. Kristen cleared her throat. "Can we talk?" she asked, avoiding his gaze for a moment, her voice softer than usual. Justine hesitated but stepped aside, allowing her to enter. The apartment was neat, with traces of his usual disorder, musical scores spread across the table, a guitar leaning against the wall, the faint smell of freshly brewed coffee in the air. It struck her, as it often did, how their lives had diverged so sharply. There was a time when this kind of disorder had irritated her, but now it felt almost comforting, a reminder of the life they had shared, however imperfect it had been. She sat down on the couch, still fumbling for the right opening. Justine remained standing, arms crossed, watching her intently. She finally spoke. "I came to apologize," Kristen began, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "I've been wrong about a lot of things, about you, about Paul, and everything that's happened recently. I shouldn't have accused you without understanding the full story. The things I said, the things I assumed, they weren't fair." Justine's expression softened, but there was still a flicker of hurt behind his eyes. "I'm not going to lie, Chris. It did hurt. The accusations, the way you treated me, I didn't deserve that." Kristen nodded, shame flooding her. "I know, and I'm sorry. The letter you wrote back then, it terrified me. I thought you might use Paul to get back at me. But now I understand. The doctor explained everything about Paul's behavior. It's not you. It was never you. I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions." Justine sat down across from her, running a hand through his hair. "The letter," he sighed, was a mistake. I wrote it when I was angry. I didn't mean half of what I said, but at the time, it felt like you were pushing me out of Paul's life. And I panicked. The idea of losing him, of not being a part of his world, was too much. Kristen could hear the vulnerability in his voice, and it struck her how much she had misunderstood his actions. "I get it now," she said quietly. "And I know you would never hurt him, or me. It's just, everything got so complicated." There was a pause, the kind that hung heavily between people who had shared too much history to simply walk away from each other. Justine finally spoke, his voice measured. "I never wanted Paul to get caught in the middle. You know that, right? The reason I was sneaking out to dance at night wasn't because I didn't care about you or him. It's just, I knew how much you hated the music, the dancing. You always said it was a waste of time, and I didn't want Paul getting any ideas." Kristen's heart sank. "You think I hated that part of you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I know you did," he replied. "That's why I kept it hidden. I didn't want Paul to see it, to think it was something he should be interested in. I didn't want to make things harder for you, Chris." She stared at him, realizing just how deeply she had misunderstood him. "I didn't hate it, Justine. I was frustrated back then with everything, but I never wanted to take that part of you away. And now, with Paul, if he ever shows any talent, any love for music, I'll support it. I won't stop him, I promise." Justine's shoulders relaxed slightly, and for the first time in months, they seemed to be on the same page. "Thank you," he said softly. "That means a lot." They both knew there was no repairing the romantic bond that had once tied them together, but they were starting to understand that wasn't the point anymore. What mattered now was Paul, and ensuring that he had the best possible chance to grow up in a home where he was supported no matter what. No, it was one of the few calm exchanges they'd had in years. "I don't want us to fight like this anymore," Kristen had said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's not good for Paul. It's not good for any of us." Justine had sighed, rubbing his temples in that familiar way he did when he was trying to keep his emotions in check. "I don't want to lose him, Chris. Every time I see you with Luke, I feel like I'm being pushed out." Luke. Kristen's new husband. She knew Justine resented him, even though Luke had always been respectful. He had never tried to take Justine's place in Paul's life, but still, there was that underlying tension. Kristen understood now. It wasn't about Luke as a person, it was about what Luke represented. "I'm not trying to take Paul away from you," Kristen had said softly, meeting Justine's eyes. "And Luke isn't either. He knows you're Paul's father. We need to find a way to make this work, for Paul's sake." Justine had nodded, though reluctantly. "Yeah, I know." That was the first step. The day they both agreed for Paul's sake to put aside their personal grievances. It wasn't easy, not at first. There were still moments when old wounds resurfaced, when Justine's jealousy would flare or Kristen's patience would wear thin. But slowly, things began to change. Kristen looked out the window again, watching the street below. She had begun taking more time for herself recently. It was something Luke had encouraged. He saw how much she had been giving to everyone else, and how little she was giving to herself. She started going back to the gym, something she hadn't done in years. It felt good to move again, to feel strong in her own body. She also reconnected with old friends, people she hadn't seen since her life had become consumed by the drama with Justine. There were community events, weekend brunches, and even an art class she had signed up for on a whim. It was freeing, rediscovering parts of herself that had been buried under the weight of past conflicts. And then there was Luke. Marrying him had been the right decision. Kristen had never been more sure of anything in her life. He was steady, kind, and most importantly, he loved Paul without trying to replace Justine. That balance was delicate, but Luke navigated it with patience and understanding. "Mom!" Paul's voice pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see him standing in the doorway, his hair tousled from sleep. "Can we go to the park today?" Kristen smiled. "Of course, sweetheart. Let's get you some breakfast first." As she moved to the kitchen, she thought about how much had changed in the past year. Her life had found a new rhythm, one that wasn't perfect but was far more peaceful. The tension with Justine wasn't entirely gone, but it was manageable. They were both learning day by day how to co-parent without letting their past cloud their present. Kristen felt lighter these days. The weight of resentment, of bitterness, was slowly lifting. She had found herself again through small acts of self-care, through new relationships, and through the quiet understanding that some battles weren't worth fighting anymore. She glanced at Paul, who was happily munching on his cereal, and then at the empty seat where Luke would soon join them. This was her life now. And for the first time in a long time, Kristen felt at peace with it. Paul was only 7, but the signs were clear. Music ran through his veins. His fingers would tap rhythmically on any surface, his body swaying unconsciously to the faintest sounds. It wasn't long before Kristen noticed, and with Justin's encouragement, they signed Paul up for dance lessons. At first, Paul had been unsure, standing awkwardly in the studio as other kids spun and leaped with ease. But over time, something began to shift. Kristen sat quietly in the corner of the studio during every class, her eyes fixed on Paul. It was lively, almost chaotic, but amidst the bustle, Paul's progress was her sole focus. She watched as his movements, once stiff and unsure, grew more fluid. His steps, once hesitant, became deliberate. Justin, too, played a pivotal role in this Paul's newfound confidence. Every other week, when Paul stayed with him, Justin made it a point to take Paul to his lessons. He didn't just drop him off and leave. Justin stayed, much like Kristen did, watching from the sidelines. But for Justin, there was more than just pride in Paul's progress. There was something personal, something deeper. When he saw Paul moving to the beat, attempting to master every step, it was like looking into a mirror that reflected his younger self, full of ambition and raw talent, but without the opportunities to nurture it. Justin had always been musically inclined, but life had steered him in a different direction. Now, through Paul, he felt a sense of renewal, a chance to witness what could have been. He didn't say this out loud, of course. It wasn't in his nature to burden Paul with his own lost dreams. But every time he watched his son move with more certainty, every time Paul nailed a sequence of steps, Justin felt a surge of pride that was difficult to contain. "You're getting really good at this," Justin said one day, driving Paul home after class. He kept his eyes on the road, but there was a warmth in his voice that Paul couldn't miss. Paul shrugged, though the corners of his mouth tugged upwards. "Maybe. It's fun, though." "That's the most important part," Justin replied, glancing briefly at his son. "When you enjoy it, you keep getting better without even realizing it." In truth, Justin had more in mind than just fun. He saw the potential in Paul, a natural rhythm that needed nurturing. Justin was determined to provide Paul with every opportunity to flourish, whether in dance or any other musical path that caught his interest. It wasn't about reliving his own past through his son, but about offering Paul the support that Justin had never had. Kristen and Justin didn't speak often about their shared involvement in Paul's journey, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. For all their differences, they had one thing in common: a deep desire to see Paul thrive. They each contributed in their own way, ensuring that Paul had the space and encouragement to explore this newfound passion. Thank you for joining me through the stories of Kristen, Justine, and Paul. Through their journey, we see that life doesn't always require perfection or clear answers. Sometimes the most important thing is to learn to listen, understand, and accept. Remember, parenting is a long process. No book teaches us everything, but love and patience will always be the key to help us overcome all challenges. If you find this story useful or touching your emotions, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next videos. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, and I'll be happy to discuss with you. See you in the next videos. Wish you a wonderful and energetic day.